energy and travel as well, and they'll kind of follow the same like a similar format basically of figuring out like what your baseline like contributors are and figuring out the big elephants in the room, which does involve going and like finding data and calculating it and figuring out how to do that, because a lot of it isn't perhaps like collected in some areas. And then after that, identifying just like what the big contributors are and what will be effective to work on versus not, or what the focus area should be. And so basically today we're going to focus on like 1 and 2 of those. So getting you information about what a carbon policy is and what counts, on calculating your carbon footprint, figuring out tools to calculate it, having like tangible breakout sessions where you go and start to figure out where the data is stored at your college and what obstacles you might need to cover. So then figuring out what you can do over the back to start collecting the data so that you can come back and make decisions because you don't know this time. And so that's what we'll be focusing on, basically finding realistic and effective fixes. Also, once you have figured out what your obstacles are and how data is stored in your college, we can see which colleges do this like in a similar way, so you can work with those colleges rather than be isolated and figure out problems separately. And throughout all of this, we're going to have kind of like feedback forms, and we want to know what questions you come up with so that we can address them, say at the next workshop, or set up more working groups in between if need be. So this is just today's schedule. First we're going to hear from Bart on carbon policy, and then we're going to hear about buildings and energy from Tom Hill, and then also about travel, which tends to be a bit elephant from Milan, before we break out and then come back with final thoughts. So first we'll have Bart.
Super. Thank you very much. So, I think I saw that this has been billed as a talk from experts. So I'm sorry to disappoint you that I'm not an expert in carbon. I'm not a scientific expert, at least. Let me just work out which. There we go. So the first health warnings are: I'm Bursar, Lady Margaret Hall. I'm not a carbon scientist. I think that's okay. We can go with that. But there are a couple of other health warnings. So So I've got some things to talk to you about and some numbers to show you, and I've even come with handouts off the LMA printer this morning. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what carbon emissions looks like in an Oxford College setting, so I'll talk to you about that. But this is not, these numbers are not highly accurate. These are deliberately very vague. There's lots of noughts, and I expect the one thing you'll hear, certainly from me and from Milan later, and in other conversations, there's lots of different variables in all of these topics. Lots of multipliers, lots of estimates. So that's, these are round numbers to get us started. I think the elephant's motif is one that we can keep on coming back to. And then the third health warning for me is this is not conference policy guidance on how to do this. This is kind of like Carbon in Colleges 101. Let's think about what's out there. What are the big things we should be thinking about? And hopefully you'll be able to go and have some conversations about it. So when I was just cycling down here, I thought that was basically warning you that I don't know what I'm talking about, the numbers don't add up, and you can't use them anywhere in the future. As long as we're all okay with that basic notion, then we will continue. I also thought that it is quite important, and then again this is a more general topic, to understand why we want to do this. So one of the things that's really exciting, I hope, and certainly got a lot of potential, is that we've got such a good mix of people in the room. So we have current students who are just interested in this, we have current students who have been thinking about this a lot. We've got all sorts of people who are either interested in this but it's not part of their day job, or interested in it because it is part of their day job. But why the college that you are studying or working at wants to do it is important. It will end up influencing where you go. So if you want to do it because you want to see Oxford as a leader in carbon management in the world university sector, that's one thing. If you want to do it because you want to save money on your electricity bill, that is another point. So I can imagine there are people in this room with one, both, and many other objectives. But where those objectives take you will be different. And as we saw from Ellie and Alice, this carbon is just one element of a range of different things. So I'll touch on that as we come through. some areas it's really obvious and easy and effective to think about the carbon emissions from an activity. There's probably some of our elephants there. And in other areas, although they're really important topics, the carbon element is not so easy to assess or actually maybe useful in helping change what we do. So those are kind of further thoughts. So this is only a short presentation and some Q&A, so I'm going at a reasonable pace. So Oxford is good for innovation, but sometimes you really don't want to reinvent the wheel. So the greenhouse gas emissions protocol has been around for about 20 years, I think. Well established, well used all over the place. And you hear terminology like scope 1, scope 2, not scope 3. Scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, you can see how that should be. Often, so direct emissions, indirect emissions and all other emissions. This is kind of where people would usually start, I think. In an Oxford College context, usually direct emissions is gas. That's things you're doing on site that are going to generate carbon. They're going to have emissions directly associated with them. Usually that's gas in the boilers for space heating or water. It might well be petrol for a lawnmower or a diesel van or something like that as well. But those are kind of ones. Scope 2, indirect emissions, where you're buying in something that is generating carbon directly. So typically in an Oxford College that's electricity. So those are two big elephants, and it's mostly what people have thought about to date, I think. Scope 3, as you can see, sort of changes the game a little bit. That's all other upstream and downstream indirect emissions, which is kind of easier if you're thinking about maybe if you're Ford and you're building cars. So for quite a long time you can think about the emissions of your factory, and then you can work on the emissions that your vehicle generates. But you might want to take ownership of all of the other emissions that your vehicle is generating while it's being driven. You may not. But these are all the different types of scope 3 you can get. And we're going to hear more about that in a minute. So I think there are a couple of them. I think let's open for questions. I've launched into that. Is everyone with me so far? Apart from Michelle?
Sorry,
Your ketchup? So I'm proposing to talk a little bit for the next 7 or 8 minutes about these elements: gas, electricity. I'm only going to touch on travel because Milan's going to talk much more about travel in a minute. Food. So in orange, you've got some of the things that I think are really important, and being a sustainable college, but which possibly carbon is not the best way to manage it. That's waste and water. There are carbon emissions involved with those, but not necessarily enormous. This comes back to why you want to do this. So in Oxfordshire, most of the waste, for instance, is incinerated. Almost nothing goes to landfill. And a proportion, 50, 60, 70, 80% of it maybe, is recycled. So the waste that's incinerated goes back into electricity generation. So that ought to pop up somewhere else in your elephant up in electricity. But we should be thinking about waste, but I don't think we should be worrying too much about the carbon emissions in Oxfordshire of waste. These are the kind of things we need to ask ourselves if we want to make decisions and have conversations. So I'm making sense so far. So I haven't quite worked out how this is going to work, but I'm going to wing it. So I have been working on this document. So looking at it now, apologies to everyone of my age group because it's fitted on quite a small piece of paper. But I think maybe if we just give out half of these, maybe I'll do one on this side. So I don't think that anyone's really done this before, but I've been had a task to get on and do this for the last few months, and this workshop has made me think about it. And I've started to think a little bit more in depth about the carbon emissions from Lady Margaret Hall, because I thought that would be a helpful way to discuss and have a look at this here. And I realised that these numbers are never going to work on the screen. So I want you to just keep on remembering that big exclamation mark slide, that these are round numbers and I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay? But I think that this can you can start to begin to see some of the different elements that would be worth thinking about if you want to talk about carbon in an Oxford project. So I'll just have a look at this in a bit more detail. First couple of lines, scope 1, gas emissions. So actually this data should be quite easy to get a hold of because most of our gas is heated. Most colleges will know what gas consumption is. 4.5 million kilowatt hours of a whole. And this, the first row, look, you've got a number and you've got a multiplier. And that's the kind of headline structure for this. 4.5 million kilowatt hours of gas at a rate of 0.18 kilogram per CO2 equivalent emission per kilowatt hour. So this is where it starts to get really interesting in where you've got estimates and ranges. So you can see deliberately we've got lots of noughts in these numbers. These are, I could have put whatever it is, 4.5682374 or something like that, but this is just illustrative. But particularly the multipliers are really sensitive. They're all estimates. They all range at a different range of different kind of things. So what is it that we want to achieve? How accurate do we want to be? What do we want to measure? Why? What are we going to do with it? These are questions you've got to work out before you spend the rest of your life trying to complete and finalise this table. I'm not going to go into that level of detail with all of them, but you can see, hopefully, if you've had a chance to look at it now, how I'm setting it out. So the second line we've got there, petrol, gas use, direct renewable heat. So at LMH we've got a ground source heat pump array, which doesn't use gas, it avoids using gas. And I'll put that in there as an alternative to gas. So if we're going to shift our gas consumption, we'll have to use some different types of technology that are going to move us away from gas. So in theory, over the next few years, if that 4.5 million went down and that 50,000 went up, that would be a helpful thing. The next pair do the same with electricity. Our electricity use straight off the meter, and our direct renewable power, which is off a bunch of solar panel arrays that we've got at Lady Margaret Hall. So you can see that we use an awful lot of electricity and we generate a tiny amount in our solar panels. Again, if those numbers shifted over the next 10 years, that might help us. Even if you only think about that, actually you can spend quite a lot of time thinking about that, and there's quite a lot of capacity to change things there. So we could just leave it there, but since I've done all the work, I'd like to share it with you. And I started to have a little look at what I thought would probably be the other two big elephants in what you probably call scope 3. So we're talking about travel and food. And here again, you've got all sorts of questions. And you know, I did have a look at Milan's slides and changed the multipliers a little bit, but I didn't use the ones he's got. And I've seen a massive range of multipliers out there. There are a lot of assumptions going into it. There's abstracts and papers and calculations and estimates and guesses.
I just wanted to say from seeing this, that how shocking the high carbon meal, like the production of CO2 from CO2.
Well, so covering multipliers in general, so I was talking about the travel multipliers. If you think of travel multipliers have a wide range and a lot of assumptions and a lot of estimates in it, the food multipliers is horrendous. I mean, that is, you know, you could spend the rest of your life, I think, looking at the food multipliers. So that has a significant red exclamation mark caution with that. But if you're thinking about, you know, a half-pound steak from a beef, from a cow that's been part of a beef-only herd from a long way away, and it's been stored and cooked in an energy-intensive way, that is a high-carbon meal. And if you have, you know, I'm not going to give you a whole menu, but if you have a low-carbon meal, it will have quite a big difference. And so I think those are illustrative, even if I might have taken some artistic license to grab your attention as well. So travel and food in a college setting, I think are big. So these are not entirely made up numbers, so the number for commuter car, commuter bus, those are extrapolations from estimates from a travel data survey that we did at Lady Margaret Hall. So they're not entirely made up. They generate real things. Business travel, business flights, student travel flights, we'll hear more from later, but you can see those are big numbers. I did go through all of the students at LMH, 630 of them, and look at their country of domicile, not where they actually live, you know, there's another estimate there. And they live on one side of the country. I took the plane flight from the capital city to London. And I did do that calculation and came up with a number of 3 million kilometres. But anyone who's doing anything to do with numbers can see that could be 4 million or 2 million. But it's millions and it's big. So there's some stuff. And food in a college setting is higher. We serve thousands of meals a day. As you can see again, these are estimates taken from our whole service point of sale and from our commercial business bookings to make estimates. I was pleased to see that actually in our student dining hall, more than 50% of the meals we serve are vegetarian or vegan. So I've adjusted that. I know from the fact that most of the meals we serve to our commercial guests are meat-based rather than vegetarian. So hence I've put some broad splits in there. But this is really indicative. So that is really the new piece of information that is being delivered by a non-expert that we can't trust or ever use. Just to emphasise the points. Having achieved that, the day before yesterday, well, how's it going to change? Because this is actually why I was thinking about it in the first place. What on earth can we do? The NIH governing body said, well, we might set a carbon target if you can convince us that it's a doable target. We're not going to set something that's aspirational for the sake of it. And so the second half of the page, I've tweaked the numbers column and the multiplier column. So obviously the numbers side of it, we are more in control of. More in control. The multiplier side typically comes from industry. So will car transport become less carbon intensive? Will plane flights become less carbon intensive? Will cows become less carbon intensive when we eat them? These are questions we don't know, but it's likely to happen. So I've reduced some of the multipliers down a bit, and I've reduced the numbers down, swapped the difference between solar electricity and grid electricity, for instance, in a fairly random way, but which conveniently generated about 50% saving. So these, I think I've probably failed, Ellie, I'm afraid, to deliver a carbon policy, a carbon target, any usable numbers, but it's as far as we've got. I don't think anyone's come up with this information before. I mean, I don't think so. I wish I'd known about it before I did this work if I had. So I think that's what I'm offering up today, really, an assessment of the state of play, what it might mean, and I think that everyone's smart enough in the room to see what conversations could have in that. I think. So I'm aware that I'll probably take more than 10 minutes, but
Yeah, it's
5-minute Q&A. Yeah, so I don't think I have any more slides. I think it was my last slide. Yep. So 5 minutes for Q&A, or we can hear from Tom about how we'll solve those problems. Question in the middle.
So it's a quick suggestion. So obviously each college can apply for a free energy audit from Box Futures. I have mine just here. So they'll do an energy audit for you with recommendations for what you can do, and also potentially with European grant funding, or still in the European Union, to pay for some of that. So that's a no-brainer if your college hasn't done that.
I think you've probably funded funding for that has gone.
No, I just got mine, and there's still some more.
Okay, cool.
Still some more.
There's still some more. Most colleges, in which case, could apply for that. Not all though, because there are some balance sheet requirements. But many colleges can. Elementaries have them.
We can. But they will do it for a fee
And
as
they
well.
definitely will do it for free.
Yeah.
And then also I think it's really worth having all the colleges using the same analyses. So
Yeah.
if there is some common metrics that everybody can use, standardised, you've obviously put some up there which aren't referenced. But it would be fantastic if all the colleges used just the same metrics, and that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying, you're absolutely right on that, Jake, that it will be worth doing in that. And that is definitely one of the ambitions of the newly founded, only 1 meeting old Conference of Colleges Environmental Sustainability Working Group, to exactly try and make sure that heads don't go running off in all directions. And that's why I emphasised that exclamation mark point at the beginning, that this talk is really designed to get people thinking about it, to hone in on it. And all of these variables and estimates in the columns are things we would sensibly join together on. Absolutely.
Yeah. First, just want to say thanks very much for putting this together. It's a really, I mean, even if it is just illustrative, it's a really interesting insight into what might be possible. It's also interesting to note that you're basically looking at a reduction by circa 50%, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change is recommending by 2030. Yeah, sure, but you know.
More ambition.
And that ambition's great. One sort of elephant in the Scope 3 tier that is noticeable, but which might not apply to LMH, I know it applies to other colleges, is the carbon footprint of investment.
Yes, very true.
And I was just wanting to kind of throw it out there.
Yeah.
How much is that something that will be thought about in this context today?
Not by me, because I basically ran out of time before I got
Sure.
some water. But you're absolutely right, it's a very clear part of Scope 3 investment. In Oxford it does seem to be a different conversation. Both conversations are going on, sometimes together and sometimes in parallel. I haven't touched on it today, but you're absolutely right, it's out there in Scope 3. That's what I know.
But this is things that, like, if there are particular topics that you want covered in workshops, we can do a workshop, for example, on divestments.
Yeah.
Or if we have a feedback form of
Yeah,
this workshop, and this is like an obstacle you think at your college, we could cover this potentially in the next workshop, because there is also the climate action plan. Part
Sure.
3 covers investments, but we can also, if it's relevant to farm policy, cover it.
I think to date, most of the thinking has been around gas and electricity, what you burn on site, what you can see, what you can easily measure and manage. But you're right, questions about what's called the downstream section is about forward thinking about our motor cars. Procurement in general, hence food, travel. These are all related topics. Yes, sorry, you have a question.
No, so I just wanted to mention briefly that even though it's already been suggested that this food statistic might be rather large and surprising, it still seems to leave out quite a large proportion of, say, methane emissions, which is another PhD that really should be on the agenda amongst the sort of carbon obsession, which is very much still a huge, huge issue. But if we're adding these things cumulatively together to see the entire impact, that would be an extra.
You're absolutely right, and I've tried to be clear, although I haven't pulled it out in the short time today. I kind of put CO2E for equivalent emissions, but you're absolutely right. Knowing what you want to do, why and how you calculate it is really clear. And I'll go back to Jake's point about metrics. It's got to be clear whether we're measuring carbon dioxide, whether we're measuring greenhouse gases and carbon equivalents, we're going to do it separately or whatever.
Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking about the danger in spending all of your time auditing and getting it right before intervening? At what stage do you just actually try out a reform?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. I did have that on my notes, but skipped over it a little bit. No, you're right, and I think that's one of the reasons I tend to like nice round numbers and elephants in the rooms and 4 things on a slide rather than trying to put this up, because I do think it's important to work out what's important, what's critical, where the elephants are. And understand what you're doing, but act on them, I would say. There's a definite tendency to think, and then head out. Fools don't want to rush in, but you've got to try some stuff. This does involve some technical stuff, but an awful lot of behaviour change. And to get from the kind of scale of the emissions and the top half to the bottom half, I'm using some of the big numbers to demonstrate actually the scale of change required. Will impact on everybody. Everyone's got to be okay with it, or willing to accept it, or move out. And so, yeah, knowing what's actually going to is just as important as knowing what could be done. So I think it's important to have. One last question.
So with these totals here, this is for the entire year?
So annual, yeah.
Okay. I know I think we're going to talk about this a bit more later on, but specifically with offsetting. So I just looked up how much it costs to offset per tonne. It's like the order of £3 to £8 per tonne, so again roughly, which makes it roughly sort of £10,000 per year per college. Do you think this is something that will be, or how tractable do you think it will be through college staff to get this pushed through? Because £10,000 doesn't seem like a lot of money to get net zero quite soon.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts?
It's interesting.
So I thought if it was like £50,000, there might be some issues, but £10,000 is not huge.
I think you've got to take it back to why you want to do this, actually. That's a fair point. I honestly don't know. I've come delighted to have a piece of paper in my hand without really thinking of the next steps. So part of this and the other sessions that we'll hear this year are about that, I think. That's a good spot there and a good intervention, I think.
Make a quick comment.
One comment, Jake.
There is and he needs to tell me to shut up because he knows I talk a lot.
You should be.
But there is an opportunity for the colleges to try and become net positive for the environment and society. So the European government has set a target, the British government has set a target to cut emissions by 80%. So if you're not in line with minus 80%, you're a drag on the rest of the country. So the carbon offset emissions for your remaining what can't be reduced is maybe eight quid a tonne, £11 a tonne. You can also do things which have social benefits, so you can be positive for society as well. But the United Nations has some which are only £1 a tonne. So they put aside a whole load. So if you just want to get going at £1 a tonne, you can apply for that as well.
Okay, good start. Bidding starts at £1 Thank you very much. All right. I think we've done what I hope to do, which is get people thinking and understanding the different sizes and scale of different actions. So that's done. All right?
And so also there'll be a breakout session, so if you've got questions, our speakers will be looking at that and you'll ask them. So just next door, I'll come to the contact.
Tom, the floor is yours. Please don't try and see it. Oh, I don't know.
Good afternoon, everybody. So hopefully this is a nice step on from that comment on offsetting. So my name is Tom Heal. I'm one of the directors of the Low Carbon Hub. Previously, I worked on the sustainability team at the university for 6-7 years, so I know your work fairly well. And this works. There we go. Who are we? We're a social enterprise. We are effectively a generator and an advice giver. We worked in the energy sector in Oxfordshire for about 10 years, and we're basically tackling emissions while trying to deliver community benefit alongside that through reinvestments of any surpluses we make in energy projects. So we're going to start with something I've stolen. I've stolen this from Professor Miles Allen, who did a really fascinating keynote at the Ox Futures conference, which Jake was mentioning earlier on, that we ran a month or so ago. The reason I think this is interesting is because it really helps us zoom down on the local context that we're involved in really quickly. So this is the IPCC scenarios for global warming, your investment needed above the baseline to get to those various outcome scenarios. 37% increase in investment initially looks like quite a big number, but when you put that in the context of our annual global energy spend, you see that it's only less than 10%. That's not a huge amount of money to be redirected into renewables to hit that zero carbon outcome. So a really, really exciting starting point, really I find that quite inspiring as a kick-off. So bringing that down to the local context, first of all, I should say, things are changing fast. This was an announcement from European Investment Bank the other week. They invest £3 billion annually currently in fossil fuel projects. That's going to go to positive investment from 2021. Obviously, it's not this year, but it's a really, really positive turning point. I'm seeing things like this in the media every day, and I find it really, really inspiring. So as I said, down to that local context, this is the City Council's announcement in January of this year. That sparked a number of other similar climate emergency declarations by other local authorities. The City Council then in April targeted zero emissions from their own stock, at least by 2030, a really, really positive trajectory. So looking at Oxfordshire, take electricity first. It's the easiest fuel to decarbonise, so I just wanted to take that as a first pass. Historically, what have we done in Oxfordshire? We've generated all of our power from Didcot, from coal, being a net energy exporter. When Didcot A was up and running fully, we were delivering about 200% of Oxfordshire's energy from Didcot. Very significant net export. Didcot A closed in 2013, and now the county is a net energy importer. Currently on electricity, we spend £450 million a year, about £1.65 billion on energy a year in Oxfordshire. Really, really big numbers, really, really exciting numbers to be able to play with if we're thinking about bringing that positive investment back into the county. So currently, where is that £450 million going? It's going out of the county. That can't be a good thing for the county economy in and of itself. It's going to these guys predominantly. Now, in the case of the university and college contract, not every college is in that, but it's going to Scottish Power. I don't want to be a complete detractor of that, I was heavily involved in the contract in the past, and it is buying from wind power, and it is buying additionality onto the grid because the certificates for that wind generated power are retired by the university and colleges. So it's broadly a very positive thing, but it is going out of the local economy, and there is an opportunity to bring it back in. Now, the really interesting thing about that 450 million number is that if you look at the total electricity load for Oxfordshire, and you look at the amount of money that is required to invest in renewables to deliver that total electricity load within Oxfordshire, if we spent that money each year incrementally on generation assets or buying energy from those generation assets in Oxfordshire, we could have this problem solved in 10 years. It really is that easy. So when you look at that IPCC graph, it really doesn't take a big change of direction to totally eliminate all of those emissions. So what are we doing? What kind of solutions can we provide? So we are, as I said, we're a generator and we're a giver of advice to help people do the sort of powering down side of things. So we do both powering up and powering down. We've got about just over 40 community-owned renewable energy systems in Oxfordshire at the moment. This is the biggest one. This is a hydropower generation on Sandford-on-Thames. You take a walk up the Thames and then double back from the pub at Sandford Lock. You can go and get this view of it. It's a pretty fantastic bit of engineering. It's doing a fantastic job powering 500 homes, but our goals, our sights are set much higher. We've got £6 million worth of assets currently. Hopefully I'm not inflicted with virus. And what we're seeing lots and lots of coming at us at the moment is a pipeline of ground mount PV. There's lots and lots of opportunities on the grid in Oxfordshire at the moment. And the big investors who were interested in this kind of market in the days of the feed-in tariff just aren't there anymore. So there's lots and lots of opportunities for renewable energy systems between 1 and 20 megawatts, which are pretty significant energy systems. But what these absolutely definitely need to be able to happen is a power purchase agreement, a long-term agreement with an energy off-taker to buy power from them for about 20 years or more. The reason they need that is because we need to bring investment to those energy systems. Investors will only invest in them if they can see revenue coming back into them for 20 years. And I'm trying to be sort of agnostic about this. I don't mind if we never end up doing a project with a university or college, but just as long as this is in your minds when you're going back to your colleges, hopefully these kind of projects will get done, whoever does them, it doesn't matter. We need this kind of generation asset going back into the county. So how do these agreements work? Well, essentially they just go alongside your normal energy supply contract. They can leapfrog from provider to provider. So, for example, the longest contract you might enter into is about 5 years. As I said, these need to be 20 years, but they could be written in so that they could just go side by side with the next contract you have. There is sometimes a charge that is placed upon having that power sleeved into your contract, but that also could be managed as part of the procurement process. The other interesting thing about these kind of projects is that colleges, someone mentioned a question about investment earlier on, colleges, the university, can play both sides of this. So they can be the energy off-taker, but they can also be the investor in the project that helps deliver it. They can be the sort of long-term pension funding that is generally interested in renewable energy projects. Is exactly the kind of investments that the university and colleges hold. So you can have the long-term upside, you can also have the long-term energy price security of knowing where your power is coming from, and you also know that by playing both sides of that, you have been the instrumental actor in bringing that additionality onto the grid in Oxfordshire, which wouldn't be there otherwise. So we think this is pretty critical, and we're basically looking for partners to help us deliver these kind of projects. So on to the more difficult stuff. Electricity is kind of the easy bit of energy, and I think I can see a pathway to solve that in 10 years, as I said, and that feels really exciting. But gas, other fuels are rather more difficult. Jake, you kindly already mentioned the Oxford Futures project. The Oxford Futures project is a big collaboration between a low carbon hub and a whole load of other actors in the city, funded by ERDF. Really, really exciting project. It's been one of the most successful ERDF projects ever. Loads of audits have been completed. 4 of our colleges. There's definitely that opportunity, either funded or not, going forward. There will be a bit of a hiatus between phase 1 and phase 2, so both of you said was true actually. So there isn't money now, but there will be money later. Yes, the really critical thing is powering down. And I did sort of note from your numbers, Bart, that there is offsetting is not something I'm particularly keen on. I'd rather see the money went into physical projects that did something that we could actually see and touch nearby. And there are also lots of criticisms of the unintended consequences of offsetting projects. So I think there are really positive options out there. I just think that some of these nuts are going to be really, really difficult to crack. The kind of the heating of some buildings in particular is going to be really, really difficult to crack. But we know that we can go over on renewables, and that's going to help us carry some of those emissions that we can't share. So how else can we help you with powering down? Well, I think we can help you with connecting you with people who've had the audits, people who've been through the process, people who have implemented some of the actions that we've recommended, some of whom are colleges, as I said, and hopefully we can help you along that journey with a bit of advice, so we're always there for a phone call on that. And what I wanted to end with, those were all the other partners involved in the Oxford Future project, and I just wanted to borrow this quote from the VC's oration this summer. So it's definitely not enough time for aspirational targets. And I thought it was really interesting what you said last about your own institutional reluctance to set a target you couldn't meet. I think it is a time for aspirational targets, actually. Because I think the aspiration can be delivered, and the only way to deliver the aspiration is to set a target and just crack on with it. And it doesn't really matter if it's wrong. It just stimulates you to take action. And what we definitely have is the means to take action, so we can definitely help with that, either whether it's with us or with others. So that is everything I wanted to say. But happy to answer questions.
What is included in the transport emissions that you showed in the pie chart box?
Really good question. So we talked on the phone about this report the other night, so I thought I would just chuck it in. What's included? Well, I'm guessing, having not read the report, but I could send you a link to the report. It's all of the, I think it's basically all emissions based on car, public transport, everything. There is I can't remember what there's a tiny other little section of,
Is that rail, right?
yeah, 1%,
Yeah, and one thing that we really stressed in this report was, of course, this is the City Council, was how much of this building's piece of the pie is Oxford University and colleges. And so it's something that, if colleges are putting in a new building and they're not using ground source heat pumps, or if they don't have smart meters on our heating, then we're not bringing that down, and that's our responsibility.
I think that it is a shame that probably is university colleges and
I mean, old buildings, it's not anyone's fault.
No, indeed, yeah.
The kind of thing, the kind of things that you're proposing or you're talking about in your PPAs and so on is a way for colleges to flip those two lines that I was talking about before in people's on my piece of paper in front of them, for the electricity off the grid and the renewable electricity. You take, you flip that 1.5 million into what's currently only 26,000 OMH. You're delivering more renewable energy. I agree with you. That's one of the reasons why it's a more ambitious shift in my bottom half, because, as you say, that's the kind of easiest one to decarbonise and do more with electricity and buy more carbon-free electricity. It's a quick win.
Yeah.
Have you done any applied sort of contracting for modular photovoltaics at all in other places?
Modular meaning what?
I off-grid standard self-sustaining modified power grid.
As in islands?
Yes.
Yeah, so we've got one project in North Oxfordshire, which is a housing development, which will be effectively, it won't need a grid connection. It'll have one, but it'll, because you need a backup effectively. But that's 18 social housing units, so it's happening. So the other really big thing that's happening in Oxfordshire, particularly at the moment, is really, really horrendous constraints. So with all of the, looking at Bart's numbers here, if you want to get anywhere near delivering the kind of decarbonisation on gas and heat that you've got in here, you're going to have to go for heat pumps. Heat pumps are going to create a huge spike in power that's consumed at all of big campus sites like yours. That's going to be a huge burden on the network. The cables simply aren't there. They're not big enough to deal with that capacity. Added to that, electrification of transport, an even bigger problem. So one of the big projects we're working on at the moment in collaboration with the university and amongst a number of others is looking at the grid as a number of different islands. Can we balance off these individual nodes through local generation, storage, and renewable heat so that they become mini islands? So they're definitely islands, but they're all sort of grid connected, but you just solve the problems from the bottom up.
Whilst not a solution for the whole country, there are suppliers of green gas. So green energy is a supplier of green gas, so you can actually get this offset concept of green gas as well.
Yeah, so I think when I looked at that before a couple of years ago at university, the problem was the volume available and the cost. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely an option, but it's not an option that everyone can jump on. So decarbonisation heat through heat pumps is the most likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a tough audience, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
So now we're going from Milan on transport.
Yeah, perfect. Welcome everyone. I'm Milan. I'm a PhD student here in Oxford, but I'm also part of the Climate Society. And the story behind this talk is basically that I think 2 months ago I computed the carbon footprint of my department, and then kind of got dragged into calculating a lot of different carbon footprints for conferences and stuff like this. And I want to share at least some of the lessons I've learned from this analysis with you. Just to get everyone a little bit on the same level, this is basically data from the last big IPCC report, and you can see that the global CO2 emissions here in this 22% are due to transport, and if you split this further out, then actually a large chunk is on road, with also cars here, but then like something on the order of 10% of that 22% are aviation. And so actually if we talk about flying, for example, global emissions are around 2%. So it's actually not that big of a number, as we do not do most of, like, let's say, industry driving lorries around or cars that much. I mean, Oxford is fairly small, and commuting is not that big as compared to other major cities. I will mostly focus on aviation, and you might think, well, aviation is actually globally not really a problem. Well, it turns out it actually is, because especially air travel is really an inequality problem. Inequality problem, just illustrated here by numbers. So in 2018, we had 4.4 billion passengers flying. Passengers flying means that if you take a flight from here, let's say from London to New York and back, you already count as 2, right? So you might, I mean, the assumption here that half of the world population is flying is completely wrong, because actually it turns out that only around 5% of the world population in a given year is flying. This is summarized by Bannister here, just in this quote of like, 10% of the population in the UK actually making up 60% of all flights. So,
Is this all flights like globally?
no, I mean from the UK.
Oh.
From people that live in the UK. Right, so, but it's always like, I mean, these numbers can slightly change, but it's basically always that, although globally aviation is not a big problem, in specific areas, so let's say in more developed countries, but also in specific environments, let's say the academic environment, it is a really big problem, and it's a really big contributor. And I will give you a couple of examples. And most of the time it's actually income is one of the best predictors for the numbers of flights you take. You can already see, like, well, there's always like a few % of the world that will basically take most of the flights. And this is just one example that I've calculated just last week from the biggest conference in my field, which is actually, well, there was, or there will be, because this conference is only happening in 2 weeks, and just really an example to illustrate this. There will be 24,000 scientists gathering in San Francisco, and they come basically from all around the world, and I've illustrated that with these like little dots, different colors and how many people are coming. And if you go through the data and if you calculate how far they're flying, it's in total 244 million kilometers. Just to put that into perspective, because I mean people usually don't understand what this means. This is 1.6 astronomical units. That means it's from here to the sun, halfway back. And this is just a single conference, right? There are bigger conferences out there, and it's 24,000 people, it's a lot, but if you compare that to the number of people that live in Oxford, for example, I'm pretty sure if you would include flying into the CO2 carbon footprint that Tom just showed of Oxford, that would be actually a really big element. Yeah, and then you can calculate the tons of CO2 you've emitted and per person, and it's definitely like, just going to this conference and going back, basically you're already emitting more than your yearly allowance would give you. So how do you calculate that? So there's really depending a little bit on the data that you have, you can as a very rough estimate this just like from Google Maps, you can just like check, okay, what is the great circle distance of 2 places? Then you get a distance, and then once you know how many people are traveling by which means of transport, these are the multipliers that Bart already touched upon. So flying is around like 200, 250, 300 gram. You can definitely go into more details if you want to. There's amazing websites that allow you to calculate that more precisely, but this is really order of magnitude. This is a good number to take. Car, bus really depends on the number of people that travel with it. Local bus is usually much higher than actually like a coach travel from one city to the other because of the numbers of people that usually sit in these buses, especially at night time in Oxford. There's a lot of buses that run half empty, or compared to the normal one, half empty, so I assume only 2 people sitting. And train, it depends on whether you catch a diesel train or whether you take the high-speed train in France, which is like, I think carbon emission-wise, an order of magnitude lower. But basically using these kind of numbers, you get a really pretty good estimate for what you have. And if you want to do this in more detail, there's definitely ways you can also do this with like whole data sets. So for this conference, I mean, there's like 24,000 people, and I've basically calculated all the distances. And there's definitely ways to do this in an automated way. Just as a comparison from the other perspective, so I've done this carbon footprint analysis for my department, the Atmospheric, Oceanic and Planetary Physics department. And for the building, yeah, well, I had to estimate that. For food, well, we only have a couple of pizza socials every year, so that's really not much. I also took into account the electricity that we have from the servers that are running. So that's, well, not zero, but clearly negligible to the big elephant in the room, which is long-haul flights. And this data I just got because every time an academic is flying somewhere and coming back, they always have to fill in these insurance forms. And this is simply data from these insurance forms that one of our secretaries just made anonymous, and so I could analyze the data. So I always had like from where to where mode of transport. And well, then you can see, you can split it up and you can do the calculation. So in that case here, for us, long-haul flights is just the killer, right? We can try to put in some like new windows into the buildings, but there's not that much else we can do. And so, just to like basically already hit you with some ideas I had following up on this analysis of policies. So, what can we actually change in order to move towards a more sustainable way of traveling? And I want to kind of like, as a little idea, I've created this graph here where difficulty to implement is on the x-axis and the impact that I think it could have is on the y-axis. So let's start with the very first one. Monitor carbon emissions, exactly, that's why we're here. So basically, once you do this, you can do this basically every year, check whether you actually make progress or not. So difficulty to implement, well, probably have to sit down for a couple of hours to do the calculations. Impact, well, direct, not that much, but it obviously triggers a lot of other things. Next thing you can obviously do is, and this is what I mean by this here, is really that you have in your whatever funding policies you have. So let's say there's someone applying for some money to go somewhere or trying to reclaim, that you have some kind of statement in there that actually low carbon modes of transport are allowed. So the Natural Environmental Research Council, for example, they have that in their policy. You are, even if the train is more expensive, you're allowed to do that. It's a very easy change, but definitely sets like a legal basis for everyone. Yes, if you want to travel by train, you can do it, no problem. Then the next one is really, and this is it's like all these analysis I've done from these conferences is, I mean, if conferences happen in Europe, yes, you can take the train, but there's usually a lot of people coming from America and from China and so on, and so even for these conferences, the emissions that you can reduce if everyone who's able to, because the infrastructure exists, actually would take the train, well, you can maybe reduce the carbon footprint by 10% maximum. So really the one thing we have to do in order to reduce the emissions concerning this academic exchange and people flying around the world is really by going virtual. Installing a virtual meeting, like a video system, is really, really cheap. I mean, it's a couple of thousand. You have like nice cameras. You can have different cameras in the room. You can have cameras that focus automatically on the person speaking. You can have microphones, and you can actually have a really good seminar just connected to other places on the world.
I was just going to say that one of my tutors wrote a paper exactly about that with some other people, and then they tried it, and it worked pretty well.
Yeah, I've attended now a couple of webinars, and there's a lot of technical possibilities that you have. And getting a meeting, such a video system is pretty easy, but then also, I mean, yeah, you have to basically somehow encourage people to actually use it, right? So if you organize, for example, in your college, a couple of these, people will understand how it works, and it's going to be pretty easy. But in many cases, there's a lot of advantages when it comes to virtual conferences. Can definitely talk more about this, but I mean, how many would like to avoid this super long flight just to talk to someone? You have it directly online, you can have a live stream, you actually include the Global South, but otherwise it's completely excluded from these kind of academic exchange, and so on and so forth. So difficulty to implement, well, not that much, but impact can actually be quite big. Next one is one that I thought about, because usually whenever we try to travel, we have to fill in some kind of risk assessment. And the risk assessment then is like, yeah, what kind of risk could you encounter? And it could be like a policy change where you simply say like, well, you also have to fill in the carbon risk assessment whenever you travel. So like, try to estimate the carbon emissions that you make by this journey, and justify why it's necessary, and could you also do it virtually instead? How much the impact of that is, I don't know whether people actually would do it or simply say like, yeah, well, I have to see that person in person. Difficulty to implement, well, you just have to add a couple of sentences probably in your policies, and you need someone to assess that. The next one, what I find really interesting, is carbon tax. So you could, for example, say, I mean, just to already mention the value of around, let's say, 10 pounds per ton or whatever, you could simply say, well, internally in the college, in the department, in the university, you simply add this amount to every journey that's taken. So, for example, if you combine that with a risk assessment where people then have to actually find out how much carbon they're emitting by traveling, you could simply say like, okay, well, this will be additionally taken off of whatever grant you have. And at the moment, carbon tax in itself just means you will have some kind of fund money in your college, in your department, available, which you can use otherwise. As an example, the ETH Zurich, for example, already does that. And so they're basically getting a lot of money on that way that they try to reinvest inside the university for around like young researchers, promoting young research and so on and so forth. What you actually do with that money is a completely different question, but it's basically a way to, yeah, just include a carbon tax. So you kind of already encourage people to take low carbon modes of transport, and then you have basically additional money available that you can use otherwise. Next step would obviously be then to think about something, okay, what to do with that money. Yes, instead of using it internally, you could also think about investing that into some kind of projects that are that would actually lead to some kind of carbon offsetting. And so these two things are obviously quite a lot of effort. I would definitely recommend to look into what the ETH, how this is happening at ETH Zurich. So definitely more difficult to implement, but potentially very, very, very big impact. And I think this is exactly where I want to stop, just to hit you with some ideas. And please just ask any questions that you have around traveling. Thank you. Yeah.
Looking forward to the target of absolute zero in 2015. How would flying ever fit into that?
Sorry? How?
Could flying ever be compatible with absolute zero?
Not in the way how it's currently done, right? It then depends on whether, like, yeah, I mean, at the moment, the only way to make flying actually zero is by offsetting it, right? And then obviously if we talk about net zero or absolute zero, you definitely see the conflicts. I find it hard to believe that you will ever manage to actually travel these far distances without emitting massive amounts of carbon. But by going highly virtual, you can definitely remove a big part of it. So basically for this conference that I presented, I've done a couple of calculations, and if you combine a couple of reduction scenarios, you can get it down to 10% of the current emissions. Mostly by going virtual, also by going, for example, towards like biannual conferences. You do it, for example, fully virtual every other year, and then you try to reduce that. And also, for example, by looking for the optimal location. Actually, San Francisco is not a great place for the conference. You can already save immediately 10% if you would move it to Chicago, because it's just like more central in the whole triangle of Europe, East Asia, and America.
You know, you might be aware of this already, but ETH in Oxford did a big research project in virtual meetings. Have you seen that? That had data from the whole university, really interesting conclusions about business class and first class travel and the relative impact that has. So just that shift from business class to standard.
Oh yeah, definitely. Sorry, maybe I should make this clearer, right? These numbers here. This is assuming economy. Once you travel business, you have to multiply by 2. Simply because you use up more space in the airplane that otherwise the airline could use for more people and squeeze more people into the same airplane. And so your per person emissions of the same airplane would greatly be reduced if everyone would actually fly economy. But I mean, you can simply see how much space they take for business section in an airplane, so like not everyone's doing that, right?
Yeah, that's another thing. Where does boat travel fit into that?
Boat travel?
Yeah.
Technically it's a good point. So a friend of mine is actually based in Paris at an oceanography institute, and for their research department, driving with a research vessel around the Atlantic is 25% of their emissions. However, it is also one way how these people do research, right? So it's kind of questionable whether you should not allow them to travel on that vessel. And I mean, you basically need a new vessel in order to have lower carbon emissions from the same engine, and there's currently no alternative than driving this vessel around. If you actually include ferries, if that's what you're talking about, I'm pretty sure you could also include ferries if you want to. However, because the speed of a ferry is so low, the distance usually covered by people on this is basically negligible. Maybe on that note, so to make this a bit more clear, usually I think of the difference between bus, train, car, and flights as a factor of 10. So you might assume then flying is 10 times worse than any other modes of transport. But I usually find this a very misleading perspective, because we usually also fly 10 times further than we would with any of the other modes of transport, right? So no one would take the car or the train to San Francisco as you fly. And so this makes this technically much worse, because we actually also get really, really far. Yes?
Just an incidental comment about cruise ships with regard to boats, that Carnival Cruise Lines produce more air pollution than all of Europe's vehicles put together.
Yeah. I mean, it is definitely a big point. but I mean, I guess this is more like in the leisure sector of, not really professional, yeah. Bart.
Just something to point out that I mentioned the point out before, but actually it's better now. So we do need to think together if we're thinking about this in collection of colleges and specifically with the university. Make sure we are counting journeys once, not 0 times or twice. So I put some academics, I deliberately put some academics travel on my little paper because they get to your conference, you see what I mean. So we do need to actually have some kind of protocol between ourselves, the colleges and university, how we are thinking about travel if we want to include that. It's a much more powerful number in your field than mine.
It's definitely important to really think about not to double count things, right? So I mean, if I would go to this conference, I would probably also include it into my own carbon footprint, and so then it would kind of be double counted. However, we should also then on the other side try to not 0 count things, right? So I mean, probably my personal perspective, but I think then excluding the flights from people that live in Oxford from the Oxford carbon budget, I think this is more towards 0 counting than, right? So, I mean, it's obviously super difficult, and there's probably not enough data around it, but we have to be aware of like double counting and 0 counting. Debbie?
Just a small comment, well, 2 small comments. One being that I worry far more about 0 counting than double counting, given that we're like our intentions here, and it tends to be that we 0 count more than double count. And the other is around the carbon associated with data and data banks and all of that, because we're not including a lot, like, so I do work in transport and we regularly talk about virtual as though it's 0 carbon, and it's far less than flying always, but I think that it's such a growing source of carbon that we need to be paying attention to it.
Yeah.
Sort of going into that virtual conference stuff, I was just wondering if we had any insights as to like the barriers between like helping us currently, because it seems to me to be like a little bit of a no-brainer, but it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be.
So I'm currently involved in a couple of projects where we basically try to convince conference organizations to actually allow for virtual participation, because many of these conferences, they basically have they have a policy, either you're here and you can talk or you can't. Like even for invited keynote speakers, they basically say like, well, you have to show up in person.
Is that for like security reasons, or?
I think it's also around their business concept, because they can just like make much more money if people actually show up in person. Because they just like can only ask for less money if people participate virtually, but it would add some effort on their side and some money they have to invest in order to have the software, the service and so on available to actually people being able to virtually participate. However, exactly on this point of like remote speaking, so like virtual participation for me always includes remote speaking, so you are somewhere else than the actual conference is happening, but it's also live streaming so that you can see what's happening at the conference, but also includes some kind of interaction so that you have some kind of like chat channels and so on and so forth. And I mean, most conferences currently just don't allow for that. And whenever you organize a conference here in Oxford, it's technically not that difficult to basically have a live streaming. Things are directly uploaded on YouTube, and everyone else in the world can either live or even like archived later can have a look at what the conference was like. And so, I mean, you can see how many people are actually not participating from the world because of restrictions on money, time, or even like freedom of travel. So if we want to include these people, this is one way to do it. Yeah, fine.
So it strikes me that a potential conflict here is that Oxford colleges make a lot of their profit. They actually lose money on students often, and they make money on conferences. But it's also a leverage point that we can control those spaces. So I'm wondering if anyone is exploring new business revenue streams by doing better at digitizing conferences and therefore allowing more people to sort of access them for a small fee online as a way of sort of offsetting, not in the traditional sense, the cost of asking conference people to sort of reduce the amount of folks who are coming.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely share Tom's perspective on offsetting is that, yes, in the very end, if there's things that we can't where we can't go to zero. Offsetting is a nice alternative. However, it is very misleading too, because you just have this attitude of like, yeah, just throw money at it and then you solve the problem.
Yeah.
However, if we would like to offset all the current carbon emissions that we have on the planet, we couldn't, because there's not enough net negative projects out there that we could actually fund, right? So in that sense, like from a more economic perspective, yes, currently you pay something on the order of 10 pounds per ton, but if actually really big industries all around the world would say like, okay, let's just offset everything, technically this price would need to increase because there's simply no projects left. There's no like land left where you can reforest and so on and so forth, right?
But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. There's still more good than harm being done because people are trying. So I think that we shouldn't shut down that conversation altogether. Although, you know, a proven additionality like a local project has. But going back to what I was thinking more so, has anyone sort of tested out models for expanding audience participation through digital means and bringing revenue through that can kind of help make up for the revenue lost by people not spending money on hotels locally?
Not that I'm aware of.
Sorry, in the interest of time, we might have to move to the breakout sessions in there, but we're going to have a specific travel workshop happening next month, at least. Yeah.
So like in your mind, it might be good to think about what travel questions you have that will relate to especially carbon targets and then writing sustainability policy versus what questions you need to be thinking about, like how to envision a conference scheme of academia, or things that would relate more broadly to travel, because we want this like workshop to be focused and like this breakout session so that you can come back after the fact to the next session and have the data for carbon policy.
Yeah, in the interest of time, we're going to actually change up, go for tea and coffee and that, and have a discussion session then after we just quickly wrap up here. So in the breakout, if you could think about, we're going to have a piece of paper with the colleges. If you could take a piece of paper which has got your college on it and meet other people who are also in it, thinking about these questions. So where can you find out more information about your specific college? What are the challenges that your specific college might face? And are there any areas of the college that you want to focus on? And from this, hopefully, will come sort of the first steps that you want to take
and that's really to figure out like what you can do together and how you can work together over the back. Just go and do some research and think about some numbers. And so we're going to want to provide like resources for you that you think you'll need. So we're going to
put videos of everything up on that we did today online, as well as all the slides will be there, and we'll be collecting from all the speakers the resources to do with their particular talks. So how to, for example, Bart another question and all that. So yeah, please do go to the website.
And if you know of any useful resources, like some you mentioned today, do feel free to contact us via the Facebook group or through the internet website to let us know that's useful for everyone. And then also while we have tea and coffee and we ask people to bring around questions too, so we give more specific questions like we do now. Feel free to ask.
Yeah, please do say if you want other topics covered and suggestions. Thank you very much for coming.